Have you ever wondered what happens when a millionaire's heart of stone begins to crack? He built an empire with a heart of stone, until the day he walked into a government building and saw his ex scrubbing the floor with two identical little girls who looked just like him. Evan Blake was the kind of man whose name opened doors before he even stepped through them. In the business world, he was known as a powerhouse, a billionaire CEO with an iron mind, ruthless instincts, and a reputation for results. He was the kind of leader people feared more than admired, and that suited him just fine. He didn't waste time on emotions, didn't believe in apologies, and certainly didn't believe in regret. To him, success was a numbers game, and he had been winning for over a decade. He lived in glass towers and private jets, surrounded by people who were paid to agree with him. His life was perfectly calculated, down to the minute. Feelings, vulnerability, and connection were liabilities he had removed long ago. Somewhere in the background of that relentless climb, there had been a woman. But wait, could this cold-hearted CEO's past be about to unravel in the most unexpected way? Julia, soft-spoken, fiercely intelligent, and grounded in a way that had once drawn him in. She wasn't impressed by his ambitions. She challenged him, made him laugh at himself, something no one else had ever dared to do. But when the opportunity came to leave their small college town and build his empire in New York, Evan didn't hesitate. He left Julia behind without a second glance. He told himself it was necessary, that she would be fine, that he had bigger things to do. And over the years, he buried the memory of her beneath contracts, takeovers, and the hollow praise of people who wanted something from him. In his world, success was the only language that mattered. Love, that was a story for people who didn't have enough work to do. But life, despite all his planning, had a way of circling back. 6 years later, Evan returned to the very town he had once escaped from. He told himself it was just business. He needed to finalize the lease for a new development site. A quick trip, nothing more. The past was irrelevant. He arrived in a black car, wearing a tailored coat, scanning the familiar streets with cold detachment. Nothing about the place felt like it could touch him anymore. He was beyond it, untouchable. That belief would only last another hour. Evan stepped into the municipal building with the same purposeful stride he carried into every boardroom. The air inside was cooler than he remembered, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. The tiled floor beneath his polished shoes gleamed unnaturally bright under the fluorescent lights. He glanced at his watch, already irritated that his attorney was running late. Small-town inefficiency, he thought. He moved toward the main lobby, scanning the bland beige walls, prepared to wait a few minutes before getting back to the real world. But then something caught his eye. Just past the reception desk near the large glass doors that led to a maintenance hallway, a woman was on her knees scrubbing the floor with a soaked rag and a bucket of water beside her. That alone didn't register. He had seen janitors and cleaning crews in countless places without ever really seeing them. What stopped him was the movement next to her. Two small girls, barely 5 years old, were crouched low on the ground beside her, giggling softly as they wiped at the tile with tiny cloths. Their cheeks were flushed and their golden curls were tied back in messy ponytails. They were talking to each other in that secret language children often share, oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. Both girls looked nearly identical. Same eyes, same nose, same energy pulsing through their quick movements. Could this shocking discovery change everything for this billionaire? At first, Evan felt a jolt of disapproval. What kind of mother let her children work like this? Was this legal? Was this safe? He was already stepping forward, prepared to say something when the woman looked up. Time stopped. It was Julia. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, practical bun, and she wore no makeup. There were faint lines beneath her eyes and a weariness in the way she held her shoulders, but it was her. Unmistakably, the same woman he had once shared late-night dreams with, whispered futures into, and here she was on her knees, scrubbing a government floor while two children, two little girls, worked beside her. Julia stared at him for a long moment, frozen. Her expression flickered between shock, confusion, and something unreadable. She didn't rise, didn't speak. The girls looked up when they noticed her stillness. One of them tilted her head and stared directly at Evan, her green eyes wide and unblinking. It was the eyes that undid him. His world tilted because he recognized them, not from memory, but from every mirror he'd ever looked into. That same sharp green, that same intensity. And just like that, Evan understood. These weren't just children helping a tired mother. These were his children. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat was dry. His thoughts were a mess of disbelief and questions. He looked at Julia again, and her face confirmed it. She hadn't said a word, but she didn't need to. The past he had buried was no longer behind him. It was standing right in front of him, scrubbing a tiled floor with matching green eyes. Evan barely registered the people walking through the lobby, the faint echo of shoes on tile, or the distant hum of conversation. Everything else disappeared, drowned beneath the weight of the moment as he stared at Julia and the two little girls beside her. The realization hadn't fully settled, but something deeper than logic had already confirmed what he feared and somehow hoped was true. These children weren't just strangers with familiar features. They were his daughters, and he had never even known they existed. He stepped closer, not out of control, but with the slow, stunned motion of a man approaching something too big to fully comprehend. Julia stood up as he neared, wiping her hands on the faded cloth in her pocket, her jaw tight and eyes unreadable. The girls clung to her legs instinctively, looking up at the tall stranger who now stood only a few feet away. "Are they mine?" he asked, his voice low, barely audible, more breath than sound. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she nodded once, the smallest movement, but it struck him harder than any word could have. His world shifted. Years of perfectly arranged priorities, sterile penthouses, and empty victories unraveled in a single breath. He looked down at the girls again. They weren't afraid of him, just curious. One of them tilted her head, her expression thoughtful, as if she recognized something in him that even he didn't. The other hid slightly behind Julia, but peeked out to study him with the same narrowed gaze he'd used in boardrooms for years. He cleared his throat, struggling for words. "Why didn't you tell me?" Julia's eyes met his, steady now, even as her voice was quiet. "I tried. I left messages, emails. I even came to your office once in New York. Your assistant sent me away. Said you weren't available for personal visits. I sent a letter after they were born. No response. Eventually, I stopped trying. You'd made it clear what mattered to you." Evan's chest ached with something foreign. Guilt wasn't an emotion he'd spent much time entertaining in his life, but now it crashed over him in waves. Not because he had missed 5 years of his daughters' lives, though that alone was unbearable, but because Julia had tried, and he had been too far removed from the real world to notice. "I didn't know," he said. She cut him off, but not cruelly. "But you didn't. That's the point." The girls tugged at her hands, clearly sensing the tension, but not understanding it. One of them whispered something and Julia leaned down to listen. When she stood again, her voice had softened just a little. "They're okay, Evan. I've done my best. They're happy. They don't know you, but they've asked about you. I didn't lie to them. I told them you were somewhere far away doing important work." He swallowed hard. "I don't want to be far anymore." Julia said nothing. She just watched him, trying to decide if she believed the sincerity in his voice. Evan didn't blame her. He barely believed himself. For the first time in years, he didn't know what the next step should be. He only knew he had to take it. He crouched down slowly, meeting the girls at their eye level. They didn't back away. One of them stepped forward and reached out, touching the edge of his coat like she was testing whether he was real. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "I'm Mia," she said proudly, then pointed at her sister. "That's Lily." "Hi, Mia." "Hi, Lily," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm Evan." They both looked at him for a moment. Then Mia asked, "Are you the man from the picture in Mommy's drawer?" Julia's breath caught and Evan turned his head sharply toward her, stunned. Julia nodded slightly. "They found a photo years ago. I didn't hide it." Lily whispered something to Mia, then looked up at Evan and asked, "Are you our dad?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. I am. Neither girl ran to him. They didn't scream or cry. But Mia smiled, just a little, and that was enough to undo him. He stood slowly, looking at Julia again, his voice steadier now. Let me know them. Let me earn this. She looked at him a long time before finally answering. We'll see, she said. But not for your sake, for theirs. The next few days passed like a strange dream Evan couldn't quite wake from. He returned to his hotel each evening with his mind racing, full of things no business meeting had ever prepared him for. For the first time in his adult life, he had no plan, no blueprint, no timeline, no strategy. He had built companies from the ground up, negotiated billion-dollar mergers, and dismantled failing departments with ruthless efficiency. But nothing in his experience had taught him how to approach two 5-year-old girls who looked at him like a mystery they weren't sure they wanted to solve. Julia didn't call and he didn't push. He knew better than to demand anything now. Instead, he stayed in town longer than intended, canceling meetings and sending vague excuses to his board. His assistant was bewildered. Evan didn't explain. How could he? There were no words that could summarize what had happened in the lobby of that building. No phrase to wrap around the realization that he had 2 daughters who had lived 5 whole years without him. On the 3rd day, just as he was beginning to wonder if Julia had shut the door for good, she sent a message through the front desk of his hotel. It was written on a small notepad from the cleaning company she worked for. All it said was, "They asked about you again. We'll be at the park after 4 o'clock." Evan read the note at least a dozen times before tucking it into his jacket pocket like something fragile. He arrived early. Too early. The park was quiet, the grass still damp from a light afternoon rain. He sat on a bench beneath a tree, watching parents push strollers and children chase each other across the playground. It was a scene he had never been part of. A world that had always existed parallel to his own but out of reach until now. When Julia arrived, she was holding both girls by the hand. They wore matching rain boots and carried a plastic bag full of crackers to feed the ducks. They spotted him almost immediately. Mia waved first. Lily followed, slower, more hesitant, but not hiding. Julia gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "This isn't for you. It's for them." He stood to greet them, unsure whether to hug, speak, or simply kneel down. Mia solved it for him by running over and holding up her hand like a traffic officer. "We made rules," she said seriously. "You can come to the park with us, but no phone and no boss voice." Evan blinked, then smiled. "Deal." They sat together on the edge of the pond, tossing crackers into the water. The girls talked easily between themselves, occasionally including him in their observations about ducks, clouds, or how they thought rainbows were made. He answered every question honestly, even when they asked strange ones, like whether he'd ever ridden a unicorn or eaten spaghetti with a spoon. Every now and then, Lily would glance at him sideways, as if trying to piece together where he fit in her life. He didn't force it. He let her look. Julia sat nearby on the grass, watching with a guarded expression. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't leaving either. That was enough. After about an hour, when the crackers were gone and the ducks had wandered off, Mia sat beside Evan and said, "We don't have a dad. But you can be one if you're nice." He looked at her, startled by her boldness, by the innocence in her voice that somehow carried more weight than any accusation. "I want to be," he said, careful not to speak like a businessman. "If you'll let me." Lily had crawled closer and was now leaning against his leg without saying anything. She didn't look up. She just stayed there, quiet and warm, and Evan didn't move. Julia stood then and walked over slowly. She didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "They're not a prize, Evan. You don't win them. You show up." He nodded. "I'm here. Let's see if you stay." Then she turned and took the girl's hands, and they walked away. Evan remained on the bench for a while after they were gone, listening to the sounds of children playing and ducks rustling in the reeds. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't even realized he'd lost. A sense of purpose not tied to profit, not rooted in ego. He had made his fortune by moving fast. But this this would take time, and he was ready for that. Evan began showing up at the park every afternoon at 4 o'clock. He didn't ask permission. He didn't send messages. He simply arrived, sat on the same bench beneath the tall oak tree, and waited. At first, it felt unnatural, even humiliating. This man who once commanded rooms, now sitting alone in a public park, hoping 2 5-year-old girls would want to see him. But with each passing day, it began to feel less like penance and more like possibility. Some days Julia and the girls came. Some days they didn't. On the days they did, Mia always ran ahead and greeted him with a handful of questions. Lily was quieter, more observant, often holding back until she decided he had earned her presence that day. It was a slow process, painfully slow for someone used to immediate results. But Evan adjusted. He learned to speak their language, not the baby talk he had once imagined children required, but the honest, curious rhythm of two small people testing the world around them. They asked about his job, his house, if he had pets, why his shoes were always shiny. He answered everything without defensiveness, even when the question stung more than they should have. He brought snacks, sometimes juice boxes and crackers, apples sliced just the way Mia liked them. He never brought toys or flashy gifts, though he had the resources to do so. He wanted them to know him, not what he could buy. Eventually, the girls began to look for him before they even reached the bench. When they saw him, their steps quickened. That was when he knew something had changed. One late afternoon, as the light turned gold and the shadows stretched long across the park grass, Julia sat next to him for the first time. She didn't speak right away. The girls were playing a few feet away, giggling as they tried to build a fort out of sticks and a forgotten picnic blanket. "They talk about you more now," she said quietly, not looking at him. Evan kept his eyes on the girls. "Good things," Julia smiled faintly. "Mostly. Mia told her teacher she has a dad who used to live in a castle, but decided to come live near the playground instead." He laughed under his breath. "That's not far from the truth." Julia's face grew more serious. "She asked me last night if you're going to disappear again." The words hit him harder than he expected. He turned toward her, his voice lower now. "I won't." "You say that now," she replied. "But they're 5. Everything new becomes permanent to them. If you go, they won't forget and they'll think it was because of them." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm still here." They sat in silence after that. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two people trying to exist in the same world again after years of being strangers. Later, as the girls began to gather their things and prepare to leave, Mia ran up to him, her cheeks pink and glowing from the play. "We drew something for you," she announced, pulling a folded piece of paper from her jacket. She handed it to him proudly. On the inside was a crayon drawing of 4 figures holding hands, 2 tall, 2 small. The small ones had pigtails. The tall ones were labeled Mommy and Dad. Evan stared at the drawing, unable to speak. Lily hovered beside him, watching his face. "Do you like it?" she asked. He swallowed. "It's the best thing I've ever been given." Julia walked over slowly and saw the picture. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression shifted just slightly. That night, back in his rented apartment, Evan taped the picture to the wall above the small desk where he used to answer emails. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't check his calendar. He sat in the quiet looking at that piece of crayon-covered paper and let it remind him that some things were worth starting late as long as you showed up. The first time Mia called him Dad, without hesitation, it happened so naturally that Evan almost missed it. They had been sitting on the living room floor of Julia's apartment, surrounded by colored pencils, glitter glue, and half-folded pieces of construction paper. Lily was curled up on the couch, tired after a long day, while Mia insisted they make official family cards to hang on the refrigerator. Evan had never done anything like this before. He'd signed legal documents, architectural blueprints, and contracts worth hundreds of millions, but never something made of paper and stickers that said, "My dad is awesome," in uneven handwriting. She held up her drawing and grinned. "Dad, can you help me cut this part?" It was just a sentence, casual, unforced, but it echoed in his chest like a bell. She hadn't looked up or paused or waited for a reaction. She had simply said it like it had always been true. He reached for the scissors with hands that trembled slightly. He looked across the room at Julia, who had heard it, too. She didn't react outwardly, but she stopped mid-step and stood still for a second longer than necessary before continuing toward the kitchen. Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed and the apartment had grown quiet, Julia offered him tea. They sat on opposite sides of the couch, the distance between them still filled with history, unspoken questions, and the slow work of rebuilding trust. He didn't bring up the moment, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. She did instead. "She called you Dad today," Julia said, her voice soft but steady. "I noticed," he replied carefully, neutral. "She's never said it to anyone before," she added. And that made him turn to face her. There was no resentment in her tone, no bitterness, just the weight of the truth. "I didn't expect it," he admitted. "I didn't think I'd earned that yet." "You haven't," she said, not unkindly. "But kids don't work like that. They give their hearts before you've proven you deserve them. And then they watch to see if you break it. Evan let that settle between them. Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I don't." Julia looked tired, but it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that came from parenting alone. It was the kind that came from carrying hope and fear at the same time. "You've been showing up. I didn't think you would. I thought you'd disappear after a week once the novelty wore off or the guilt started to fade." "I almost did," he confessed, surprising himself with the honesty. "Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't think I deserved any of this. I still don't. But I want to be here. Not just as a guest or a name in a phone book. I want to be part of their lives. And if you'll let me, part of yours." Julia didn't answer immediately. She sipped her tea, stared at the framed crayon drawing the girls had made earlier that now sat propped on a shelf. "They adore you," she finally said. "Even Lily, and she doesn't warm to people quickly. They trust you, Evan. That means I have to start trying to trust you, too." He nodded. "Whatever pace you need. I'm not going anywhere." It was the first time he'd said that and truly meant it. Later, as he stood by the door preparing to leave, she surprised him again. "You don't have to knock next time," she said. "Just come in." And just like that, the wall between them didn't fall completely, but a door was opened. Small, quiet, but real. He stepped out into the cold night air, the city dim around him, and for the first time in years, he felt grounded. He wasn't just chasing redemption anymore. He was building something fragile, imperfect, but real, and he was ready to fight for it. The following weeks unfolded in a rhythm Evan had never known before. His life, once driven by urgency and ambition, began to revolve around school pickups, grocery lists, bedtime stories, and tiny miraculous moments that had nothing to do with business. He learned that Lily liked her toast with exactly 3 drops of honey, that Mia couldn't fall asleep unless the closet door was fully shut, and that both of them insisted on wearing mismatched socks because they were more fun that way. These small details might have seemed meaningless to someone else, but to Evan, they were everything. Every habit, every request, every messy drawing was a piece of a world he never thought he'd be allowed to enter. And now he was living in it. Julia watched all of this quietly. She didn't interfere when the girls piled books into Evan's lap and demanded stories, or when he burnt pancakes and made the entire kitchen smell like smoke. She didn't scold when he brought them home 20 minutes late because they insisted on counting every flower in the park. She watched him slowly turn into the kind of man she once thought he couldn't be. It wasn't perfect. He still answered work calls too often and sometimes forgot where the extra socks were kept, but he tried. And trying, in Julia's eyes, was more than he had ever done before. One evening, just after dinner, the girls were curled up in a blanket fort they'd built in the living room, their laughter echoing through the apartment. Julia stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, and Evan was drying dishes beside her. It was quiet, warm, the kind of peace that only came when nothing extraordinary was happening. And yet, it felt extraordinary in its own way. "I used to picture this," she said softly without looking at him. "Not exactly like this, but you here, us together. Then I stopped. It hurt too much to imagine something that never came. Evan placed a plate carefully into the cabinet and leaned back against the counter. I didn't even let myself imagine it. I was too busy pretending it didn't matter. Julia finally turned to look at him, her face calm but serious. Why now? Why did you really stay? He hesitated before answering, not because he didn't know, but because the truth still felt fragile inside him. Because I saw them and I saw you. And for the first time, I realized I'd built my whole life around the wrong things. I have more money than I can spend, more power than I ever needed. But I never felt anything real until I saw Mia holding your hand and wiping the floor beside you. She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. There was a long silence filled only with the soft sounds of the girls' voices from the other room. I'm not asking for a second chance, he continued. I'm asking for a first one. The one I never gave myself or you or them. Julia looked at him for a long moment. I don't know what this will be, Evan. I don't know if I can call it family again, but you've become part of their world, and I can't imagine taking that away from them or from you. His chest tightened at the quiet acknowledgement. He didn't need more than that. Not yet. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep under their mountain of pillows and stuffed animals, Julia walked Evan to the door. Before he left, she handed him a small folded piece of paper. It was a permission slip for the school's parent breakfast day. They asked if you'd come, she said. He looked down at the form, stunned. Are you sure? They already told their teacher you would, she added, smiling just a little. You better not make them liars. He chuckled quietly, more touched than he could say. I wouldn't miss it for anything. When the door closed behind him, Evan stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at the paper in his hand. It was small, barely bigger than a postcard, printed with cartoon eggs and smiling coffee cups. But to him, it might as well have been the most important document he had ever signed. Because this time, he wasn't building a company. He was building a life. The morning of the school's parent breakfast arrived cold and bright. The kind of morning that wrapped the world in pale gold light and crisp air. Evan woke up earlier than he needed to. The nerves in his chest tight and unfamiliar. He had stood on the stages of global conferences, faced investors who'd flown halfway across the world to challenge his decisions. But nothing had ever made his palms sweat the way this did. It wasn't fear of failure. It was the weight of being seen. Not as a CEO or a strategist, but as a father, something he was still learning how to become. He wore a soft blue sweater Mia had once said made him look less serious, and he arrived 10 minutes early, clutching a small tray of blueberry muffins he had stayed up late baking with Julia's guidance. When he walked through the school doors, the hallway was already buzzing with the chaotic joy of young children and nervous parents. He caught a glimpse of construction paper artwork taped to the walls, names written in bold, uneven letters, and drawings of stick figure families under smiling suns. At the classroom door, he paused. He could hear their voices, high, excited, and familiar in a way that tugged at something deep in him. When he stepped inside, both Mia and Lily spotted him at the same time and ran toward him, wrapping their arms around his legs with a force that nearly knocked him backward. The teacher smiled, greeting him with the calm familiarity of someone who already knew who he was. The girls beamed with pride as they led him to their table, where a paper place card labeled Daddy had been carefully drawn in purple marker and glitter. For the next hour, Evan listened to the girls talk about their favorite books, their plans for recess, and how they were learning to spell the word important. They took turns feeding him bites of pancakes, and insisted he try the school juice, which was totally weird, but kind of good. They introduced him to their classmates as their dad, and each time the word left their mouths, it echoed a little louder in his heart. Julia arrived near the end of the breakfast. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him seated between the girls, his hands sticky with syrup and his hair slightly mussed from where Mia had tried to fix it. There was something in her gaze, something fragile and soft that hadn't been there before. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. After the breakfast, Evan walked them back to class. The girls clung to his hands until the last possible second. And before disappearing through the doorway, Mia turned and whispered, "You came. I knew you would." Back outside, Julia waited with her coat wrapped tightly around her. They walked in silence toward the car, but it wasn't the silence of discomfort anymore. It was something shared, something healing. "I signed the girls up for a weekend art class," she said after a while. "They asked if you'd come with them." Evan smiled, his voice steady. "Of course, I will." Julia stopped walking. She looked at him with eyes that no longer carried walls. "You're not the same man who left." "I know," he said. "He didn't deserve any of this. But I'd give everything to be worthy of it now." She nodded. And in that quiet nod was 1,000 things neither of them said aloud. Forgiveness. Trust. A future they hadn't dared to hope for before. Weeks passed. Evan moved into a smaller home not far from Julia's, one with a front porch where the girls could sit and draw chalk masterpieces in the sun. He still worked, still built, but everything was different. He measured time in bedtime stories and school calendars instead of quarterly reports. He planned his life around art shows and pancake breakfasts, not boardroom summits. And slowly Julia began to let him in, not just as the father of her daughters, but as someone who could stand beside her, not in apology, but in presence. On a quiet Sunday evening, as the girls played outside and the sky turned a dusky pink, Julia stood beside Evan on the porch, her coffee warm in her hands. He reached over and gently brushed a curl from her face. She didn't pull away. "Are we okay?" he asked. She looked at him, really looked, and then smiled. The kind of smile he remembered from years ago, before the silence, before the distance. "We're getting there," she said. "And this time, we're going together." The sound of laughter echoed from the yard. The sun dipped low, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a question or a risk. It felt like a promise. Stay tuned for more heartfelt stories on Millionaire in Love.